Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology. And today we have a conversation with Naveeda Khan. We are going to speak about riverine and climate discourses in the Chars of Bangladesh. Very quickly, I'm going to introduce our esteemed speaker today. Naveeda Khan is a professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University and an affiliate faculty of the Center for Islamic Studies, Comparative Thought and Literature, and the program in Environmental Science and Studies at JHU. She has worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Dhaka and Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, Travelers and Immigrants Aid of Chicago, and the Field Museum of Natural History. Her research spans riverine lives and national climate policy in Bangladesh, UN-led global climate governance processes, German Romanticism, Bengali and Urdu literature, and writings on the environment. That's actually a lot and very, very interesting and diverse. She's the author of Muslim Becoming, Aspiration and Skepticism in Pakistan, River Life and the Upspring of Nature, and In Quest of a Shared Planet, Negotiating Climate from the Global South, and editor of Beyond Crisis, Re-Evaluating Pakistan. She is currently working on 2 manuscripts, Householding on a Warming Earth, Char Lives and Livelihoods in Northern Bangladesh, and Skelling and the Romantic Method. Naveeda, thank you so much for making time and welcome to Doing Sociology.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ritvarna.
So let me begin by asking you about the specificity of your field site in Bangladesh and what you could tell us about your research there.
Sure, yes. So I started research there, I would say 2010 or 11. And at that time, there was quite a lot of focus in the coastal areas of Bangladesh, and particularly because of the concern over rising ocean waters and inundation of at least the coastal area, or at least the salinization of the lands there. And at the time, I thought, it would be interesting to go someplace which hasn't quite the aura of urgency as the coastal area in Bangladesh. And so I decided to focus on rivers further up in northern Bangladesh, specifically the river, Jamuna River, which is the Brahmaputra in India and then becomes the Jamuna when it crosses the border between India and Bangladesh. And so I located myself fairly up north, to see how it is that something like an intimation of climate makes its presence within this landscape and within the communities that live on it. And I've been tracking that sort of growing acknowledgement of the presence of climate in these parts since 2010 till about 2017-18. And then again, I took it up in this past year in 2023. So yeah, so that's just to give you a sense of like why I chose this particular location of Riverine, Bangladesh, and where it is with respect to, say, the coastal and what it is that I was tracking there.
Right. And I think this makes so much sense to so many students who might be interested in how to sort of, identify a field. Thank you for that. Let me also ask you about what are the methods that you use in your field and why are they important to you as a researcher?
This is a great question because it's not clear from the outset what kind of methods one should use. We have sometimes a notion that students need to be well-rounded in specific methods before they do their field work. But I'm strongly of the opinion that students should be exposed to the sorts of areas that they're interested to do work in and to the communities to see if the methods can't be elicited from that encounter. And so one of the things I found when I got to my field site, first in an exploratory way without any preconceived notions of what I was going to study, was that, people moved a lot and they were constantly moving, of course, because of erosion, but they were also moving for migration, or they were moving, as their land came back from after it had been eroded, so moving back to their patrimony and so on. And so that made me realize that whatever the methods I chose, they would have to pay attention to this dimension of movement. And so one of the things I did was to work with a GIS person to create a satellite map of the area and to transpose onto it. So you know you can see the landform and you can see the wall, and then to transpose onto it sort of the political units of villages and unions and upazillas and zillas, and then to ask people, okay, so where were you born and where did you move to first, where did you move to next, and keep asking them this and plot it on this map. And what was also interesting is they would say, yes, now there's land there, but there wasn't land there then, or there was land there and now there isn't land now. And so to try and also capture that in my plotting, and that really gave me right away a sense that people were actually not moving away. They were moving in circles, right? Trying to avoid completely alienating themselves from this, not just the landscape, but also the sociality and the networks that they had. And so that method was born out of sensing something and wanting to track that. And then I followed it up, of course, with more classical things, like I did a household survey, I did a mapping exercise of the households in the area. I also, of course, did participant observation, and I did fun exercises with children, organizing exercises to get a sense of like how they perceive danger in their landscape and so on. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, I was muted. Uh,
No worries.
yeah, yes, it does answer my question. And I want to also ask about, how Chora lives would be configured by nature, and how do land, the law, and lives, make in contributing the social? What are the factors that bring it together?
Yeah, that's a big question. Thank you for it. One of the things that I wanted to track right away was, of course, how does one study the history of a place that moves? Essentially, the land has been moving. It has been configured in different kinds of land holdings. When I was there, large parts of the area, some of one of the villages I was working on was not there. So I was very interested to understand what was the history and memory that was significant in shaping this place. But then as I got further into it, I realized that the law, whether in the form of land settlements or land records or fights over lands, was a very nice way to actually get a sense of that history and memory of a place. But that still kept me, as it were, within the scope of the social. And I was very interested to try and figure out how one can bring in attention to nature within one's sociological framework. We're so used to being oriented towards people, their conflicts, etc., as a way to ask questions about norms and their transgression, that we sometimes forget that it's not only the social that's working on us. And I wanted to move away from an environmentally deterministic sort of perspective. I didn't want to just have a straightforward claim that the fact of there being a river to have to deal with, or a land that moves, that was the primary mover of people's, of course, it was a primary mover of people's bodies in space, but not necessarily the primary movers of their social norms, social organization, social structure, etc. There is a way in which the social can be quite blind to and occlude the place of the physical environment on itself. So I decided to really think about nature in terms of tendencies, orientations, sort of the statistical norms of the geological, the physical, the biological, and the social, right? And so I started to think of it in terms of something more ideational, something more in one's mind, and in one's expression. And once I did that, I felt that I was better able to understand how nature was working through the social in things like the law, in things like people's lives, and so on.
So could you also talk about how the people in the Chora, experience flood and erosion, because it's also a major theme that you deal with.
Yeah, so what I found very interesting is how people talked about floods very differently from the way that they talked about erosion. In the NGO literature, in the literature to do with sort of disaster management and so on, they're both sort of, put under the category of catastrophe, right, or disaster. And the understanding is, how do we build people's resilience to deal with floods and erosion? But when you actually stay in the chores and talk to chore dwellers for any period of time, you realize that they experience the two quite differently. I mean, in some ways it's obvious, because floods are rarer occasions and they are more thoroughgoing, right? Whereas erosion happens, it can be concentrated seasonally, but also happens a little bit at a time all the time, because the chore lands are unconsolidated soil structures. And so, there's a tendency to just succumb to gravity. But what I realized is that floods were labeled. It was the 98 flood or 1992 floods. And they were labeled because they were also tied to things that were happening on the national scene. And so in an interesting way, it made me realize that floods, which has been a predominant way by which Bangladesh has been studied and framed, etc., floods are national events that, even though people experience them very locally, they get very quickly tied into what's happening in the capital, or how it's being talked about internationally. And so people's narratives about what they experienced during those floods get woven in with the national timeline, right? But because erosion is constantly happening, what's interesting is people don't remember. Like they can tell you they moved from point A to point B, but they can't specifically remember if they moved because their house broke, or the village broke, or and who did they turn to, and what they did when the erosion happened. They just know they moved, right? And it made me realize that it occupies a different part of their brain, right? It's a part of the brain that's much more imbricated with the local, with the, as I said, the natural tendencies of this place to move soil in a certain way or move water in a certain way. And so consequently, it was more in the register of the everyday rather than in the register of the national.
That's a very interesting thing that you have said, about how people experience the two natural disasters or man-made disasters differently. Another big question: how can we understand global climate discourses, and what kind of contribution do you think your work on northern Bangladesh makes to illustrate some of the debates that emerge out of these discourses?
So, the global climate discourses, which are organized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, exists in a completely different time-space continuum, it feels to me. They happen once a year. I mean, they're preceded by many such meetings, but really the big Mela sort of takes place, November, December, a particular part of the country puts it on. There is a spectacular kind of dimension to it. There is a sense of like attending it and being seen as attending it, etc. So I feel a little bit that that framework or that context is quite divorced from people's everyday lives, and that's not an unusual thing to say. People comment on that all the time, that these UN-led conventions, etc., feel very remote from what it is that people are experiencing and undergoing in their own contexts. This is not for lack of trying. I mean, there are very many very well-intentioned people within the UN, within various civil society sectors, who really have made it their task to make people present in these spaces, either physically through the large numbers of civil society activists and also people representing their communities, but also through, showing videos, having events, photographs, etc. But even so, the focus, climate change within these discourses tend to be more of a technical problem, right? And the technical solutions sought to attend to it. The way in which I think of my fieldwork in Bangladesh in any way, speaking to what's going on in these climate negotiations, I would say, is through a constant sort of a constant sort of spur to the process, that they're not in the right temporality, right? And that what is it to feel urgency, right? And how is it that they haven't quite got the scale right, that they can't get close enough to people's realities? So these are some of the ways in which I hope that my work, if read by people in the negotiations, etc., will think about. And they won't just say, oh, this is yet another instance of a community in the throes of climate change, and assimilate it to case C as opposed to their case A or B. But what I hope that my ethnography in Bangladesh aims to show is how it is that people there are also thinking about these issues, and and how it is that they should give pause to the climate discourse to say that we are not entirely getting our fit right, right?
Mhm.
So anyway, I'll stop there. I don't want to overspeak.
No, no, I think it's been, quite a measured conversation so far. You've been really, really responsive to all the questions. There's another very interesting thing that I came across, about evoking mythological figures to understand, relationship to bodies like the river by women in northern Bangladesh. So, how does one understand that? And, do you think there is a paradox that can be unpacked?
Yeah, so I mean, here we get more into the specifics of the region and of Bangladesh in the region, as opposed to the sort of zoomed out perspective of the climate negotiations. So what's interesting to me, and this is an interest that pursues from my previous work in Pakistan, is that, how is it that people have lived next to each other for a long period of time, but can forget? What is that forgetting about? And the specific issue that interested me in the context of my field site is that this was, Tangail, Shirajganj, etc., were places of large Hindu communities. And it is true that Hindus have been leaving the country since even since 71, they were leaving prior, but even since 71, and that they have been adverse possession of their lands and so on. But at least in the movement maps that I mentioned to you earlier, what I found was that Hindus of this area had not all left. They had moved to particular enclaves in Shirajganj and in Tangail, and actually, even though they didn't retain a relationship to the land, held on to the land documents so that if anybody should come looking, they will find them with their documents, right? And so I was very interested to see how in my field sites, it was as though Hindus had never lived there, you know, and so I wanted to understand what had happened to memory. And going back to what I said earlier, because I was interested in this picture of nature as one given to this place because of orientations, tendencies, etc. I wanted to see how certain tendencies of nature in this place also worked against remembering, right? And colluded with human acts of injustice. And so that was what drew me to a particular instance of suddenly women remembering, Ganga Devi, and remembering, myths that were otherwise not part of their everyday lives. And that felt very paradoxical to me. How in the course of everyday life, there's a forgetting, how there is a kind of collusion between nature and memory in terms of forgetting, and then how it is in certain instances of personal catastrophe, in this case, children dying by drowning, there's a recollection of the existence of Ganga Devi and also Khwaja Khizir and so on. So I found unpacking that to be very, very fruitful to me. And it helped me get to, how memory works, how, time punctures the present. Also helped me to get at, in a separate paper from what I wrote in the book, helped me to get at how climate may be seen as aligning within these mythological stories, right? So something about the way in which the myth was changing said something about how the place, the environment was offering up different kinds of provocations and lures to the people living there.
Would you say that this is one of the strengths of ethnography as a research method, that it lets us, uncover some of these very hidden stories which otherwise would go unnoticed?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about ethnography is that you don't just go in and capture people's opinions and perspectives, that you stay a while and you start to, not only see what life looks like over a period of time, but also to, hear things that for people just exist in the edges of their cognition or their consciousness. And so that's one of the things that ethnography attunes you to, is not like behavior as opposed to what people are saying, but rather what is it that they attend to right away, and what is more at the fringes of their attention, and how it is that gestures and speech have so many dimensionalities to it. So one thing that's articulated at a particular moment acquires a different kind of resonance at another moment. So to be able to be there at those different moments, is also very telling. Without, of course, having the sense that you have to be there all the time to capture everything, right? To also think that there is something singular about the one thing that you saw, in telling about what you experienced.
Right, right. I'm sorry, there are some crackers being bursted just outside my house. It's Diwali. How do people make sense of nature's death in these situations?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yes, yes, it's the crackers. So, how does one make sense of the death of nature in these situations? How do people deal with that?
So yeah, so I used that phrase "death of nature" in a particular paper that I wrote, but I meant something very specific. It was something people were saying because I had shown up to study the river at a time when, they felt that the river was pretty much dying. I mean, now we know the Jamuna River is not dying. It's a pretty large machinery, so it's not, the engine isn't about to go out on it at any time. So I was trying to understand what they meant by saying the river's dying or nature's dying. And I realized that it was because in some ways, their experience of the river had changed, that the river had a history, that they had a history with the river, but that the river also had a changing character over time. And they were reflecting on a particular phase of the river's being, which is what was to be far more mute than it had been in the past. And by mute, I mean not as destructive, not as erosive. And of course, this has to do not with any reason other than the fact that just up the river, the Bangladesh government had built a bridge, the Jamuna Bridge, and it had changed the ferocity of the waters. The bridge had taken most of the energy, and so these chores being further downstream were experiencing a very different kind of river than they had. I just found it really interesting that they talked about it in terms of death, right? And I proposed in my paper on that it wasn't necessarily death in an apocalyptic sense, end time sense, but rather it was death to reflect how they were absorbing a certain kind of discourse of disaster management, right? And how it had, disaster management had in some ways taken what were things that they had lived with ordinarily, that had inconvenienced them, but had also benefited them, and put them all under the rubric of disaster, right? And so I found that quite interesting that in some registers, they could talk apocalyptic to say, we are experiencing climate change because of the wrath of God on humans. But at other registers, the same seeming apocalypse was actually produced by development discourse and how they were absorbing it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for that response. I have one last question, because we have been dealing with this topic quite a bit. And from the perspective of a pedagogue, how does one teach about climate change in social sciences?
Yeah, so this is something I've been struggling with for a long time because there's a way in which people assume that there's a frontality to climate change, that one just has to go in and say climate change is this, and then those who are told that suddenly have some sort of light bulb go off in their head or a switch, and they can see climate change, right? But the truth of the matter is that climate change is a very abstract reality. It is, comprised of many, many data sets that have been modeled and that have a lot of speculation, uncertainty, projections, etc., built into it, and it's incredibly heterogeneous. So one person's climate change isn't another person's climate change. These are all known things, so I'm not saying anything new there. But what I found is, that activists, well-intentioned anthropologists, etc., but just sort of like so suddenly beset by trying to teach about climate change, right? And I thought that they haven't actually, I mean, maybe activists have to do this, but at least the academics haven't yet thought properly about what is at stake in terms of teaching about climate change. What does it mean for a social scientist to teach it? I can imagine teaching it if I'm teaching a course on like new politics or emergent issues, right? But what does it mean to teach it within a class on, say, ritual, or a class that has to do with the economy or whatever, right? Or local economy or diverse economies? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't have a firm response. But one thing that I am curious to do is to see if one could make climate into a category the same way that class has come to be an important analytic for us, or gender, or race, right? Can one do a climate analysis as one does a gender analysis, right? And just recently, I just saw yesterday, the Lancet has a new report. Lancet is the journal of all the advancements on the medical sciences and social sciences, and they were talking about 52 or so indices by which to really gauge climate change's impact on health, right? And so that could be one of the ways in which one does it, like one to integrate it so deeply into one's deep structure that one just looks for those things, right? So I'm thinking that is one way. But again, I think that we can't just assume that because it's a problem in the world and that it needs a national, international response, and it needs activism on behalf of suffering communities. The social scientists clearly have a way to teach it, because then in some ways it really confounds what we do as independent people, as citizens, as activists, and what we do as scholars, right? And I would like the way that we teach climate change in our classes to still have a clarity in terms of what are the intellectual stakes, what is it that we're teaching, without necessarily just reproducing the discourse, you know?
Right. That makes so much sense. And thank you so much for all those responses and engaging with the questions so thoughtfully. Thank you very much, Naveeda, for this conversation. I actually learned a lot in terms of, anthropological research and the specificity of the field, the methods, and what you said about the coming together of the two. So once again, thank you so much. And I hope that our viewers will benefit from this conversation.
And thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I really enjoyed thinking about these things with you.
Thank you. Thank you.